All right. Welcome, everyone. We are very privileged to have Robert Spencer with us. He's a director of Jihad Watch. Uh, Let me quickly let everyone know how we are going to run this space. I'm going to quickly welcome and introduce Mr. Robert Spencer. And then after uh, that, Robert is going to speak, and after his speech, we are gonna take some question and answers, questions from everyone. So that is gonna be the format. So let me welcome again Mr. Robert Spencer. He is director of Jihad Watch and author of more than 23 books, including the New York Times bestseller, The Truth About Muhammad and Politically Incorrect Guide to Islam. He has been co author with uh, Pamela, The Post American Presidency. He has led various seminars for the U.S. Central Command, U.S. Army Command, General Staff College, the FBI, and the U.S. intelligence community. Uh, so he's also has been columnist for Front Page magazine, uh, and he has a program of Dr. Horowitz Freedom Center. Uh, so he's very kind of had been actively engaged with such programs. Uh, a little bit background. Uh, so uh, I I would briefly talk about it, and then I would let Mr. Spencer share that with you. Spencer received a BA in 1983 and MA in 1986 in religious studies from the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. His master thesis was a Catholic history. Uh, he has been studying Islamic theology and law and his space since 1980. So he brings in a lot of experience on that. So again, I welcome Robert Spencer, and then I will like to give now mic to Mr. Spencer to share his thoughts. Welcome, Mr. Robert Spencer.
Thank you very much. I trust you can hear me. In
Yes,
any
we can.
case, excellent. Okay. Uh, I have been asked to discuss jihad, and of course, this is one of the foremost challenges that the free world faces today. It is not getting much attention nowadays because of the Ukraine and Russia war and other issues that have taken it off the headlines. However, as people in India well know, it is very much alive and it will continue long after there is peace in Ukraine and after everything that is the preoccupation of the current headlines is history, because the jihadis believe that they are fighting a 1400-year-old struggle. And they do not believe that this struggle will ever end until the end of the world itself. And so non Muslims need to be aware of this, and very few are. Actually, the governments of the world are in virtual universal denial about the nature and magnitude of the threat that they face. And they pretend that various jihad entities, such as the Islamic Republic of Pakistan and others, can be pacified by various concessions, and that they will no longer pursue a belligerent or aggressive stance toward their neighbors if they are given various sums of money or various territorial concessions. This is, however, not the case and has never been true. In fact, the jihadis themselves tend to see the world in terms of strength and weakness. And they see the willingness of non Muslim states and other entities to grant them concessions and make gestures of goodwill toward them simply as signs of weakness that should be exploited, rather than as gestures of goodwill that should be reciprocated in kind. Consequently, the very attempts of the United States, the European Union, the government of India, and other entities to mollify and pacify various Muslim states and other entities only ends up making the jihadis more emboldened and aggressive than they were initially. And so, what we are locked in now is a vicious circle of appeasement, followed by more aggression, followed by more appeasement, which only invites more aggression. It's a ridiculous situation, but it's based on a denial of the reality of jihad. Jihad is a fundamental concept within the religion of Islam. The word, of course, means struggle, and there are many jihads, just as there are many struggles in the English language. Jihad as a struggle can take completely peaceful forms. For example, the Islamic Republic of Iran has a Department of Agricultural Jihad. This does not involve blowing up things on farms. It involves trying to increase crop yields, to struggle to increase the efficiency of the agricultural sector. However, in Islamic theology, jihad very clearly means warfare against unbelievers in order to bring them into the fold of Islam. And if the unbelievers do not convert to Islam, then they must be subjugated under the hegemony of Islamic law and forced to submit to the authority of the Muslims and restrict their own practices in various ways, and pay a tax, the jizya, to the Muslims as a sign of their submission
and
and
servitude.
servitude.
This is. I'm now hearing myself coming back. I
I
can't speak that way.
Can you fix that?
Yes, my apologies, Mr. Robert. Someone opened the speaker, I guess. My apologies.
Okay, thank you.
Please continue.
So the idea of jihad is an open-ended and universal declaration of war by Islam and by Muslims against non-Muslims. Obviously, this does not mean that every Muslim is a jihadi or is waging war against non-Muslims. And we can see that there are many that are not. However, the non-Muslim world has also allowed itself to be deceived by assuming that Muslims that are not waging jihad are on their side and are actually against jihad forces. In reality, many Muslims, here again not all, but many, that who are not waging violent jihad are waging jihad by other means. That is, they are attempting to bring about the subjugation, this conquest and subjugation of non-Muslim entities by other means besides warfare. And some of these means involve deception and giving non-Muslims the impression that there is no jihad, and that anyone who thinks that there is a jihad is simply an anti-Muslim hate monger who is trying to stir up discord. In this, they attempt to foster complacency among non-Muslims, as well as to stigmatize the idea of non-Muslims understanding jihad, studying jihad, and above all, resisting jihad. They have had tremendous success with this all around the world in popularizing the concept of Islamophobia as some sort of irrational hatred of Islam and Muslims that is victimizing Muslims around the world. Many people in India, in Europe, in North America, and elsewhere have been fooled by this. And they think that any opposition to jihad, even any honest discussion of what inspires jihad activity within the Islamic religion, is something that is to be rejected and opposed as if it were worse than the jihad itself, because supposedly innocent Muslims are victimized as a result of these kinds of inquiries. This is entirely false and fantastic. This is not to say that no innocent Muslims have ever suffered inconvenience or even been attacked. Obviously, that would be false to assert. At the same time, however, the magnitude of jihad activity worldwide is far, far greater than the magnitude of so-called Islamophobic activity. And to assume that any analysis of jihad is simply a manifestation of some kind of irrational prejudice is not only counterfactual, but naive and ultimately suicidally self-defeating. Because, of course, it creates a situation that jihadis can and do exploit, and a context in which they are able to act with virtual impunity, because everyone who would have called attention to their activities and formulated a coherent strategy to oppose them has been forcibly silenced or intimidated into silence. And that is the situation that most of the world is in today, such that many people assume that there is not a genuine problem with jihad, but there's a big problem with Islamophobia. The very word Islamophobia, although there have been claims that it has appeared in earlier literature, these were obscure references that nobody had found, and this was not a common word until the 90s, when various Islamic groups decided to adopt this word in an attempt to inhibit and intimidate into silence criticism of jihad activity. And it's been a great success, a tremendous success for them around the world. Now, what can and should be done? In the first place, although the situation is very grave now, and nobody seems to be paying attention to the gravity of it, it really admits of a relatively simple solution. Many of these problems in many countries around the world are either created or made worse by the fact that authorities are often afraid to do what needs to be done in order to make the problem go away. For example, in the United States, polygamy is illegal, and yet Muslim polygamy is widely tolerated and ignored by law enforcement authorities because they don't want to offend Muslim communities. As a result, because most of the people who practice polygamy are also true believers, that is, they believe in every bit of Islam, and consequently, they not only believe that a man can have 4 wives, but they also believe that it is perfectly within the duties of every Muslim to wage jihad against unbelievers. And so the same people who are violating the law against polygamy are often jihadis themselves. And because the United States doesn't want to, the American authorities don't want to offend the Muslim community, they ignore polygamy. A few years ago, there was a jihadi who had organized a training camp in New Mexico, a very remote area where there were very few people around. And his name was Siraj ibn Wahaj, and he created a training camp for children where he was training children to become suicide bombers. And his plan was to send them into schools where they would blow themselves up and kill other children. The plot was discovered, and he was arrested before it could be carried out. However, he was already known to law enforcement because he had entered into a polygamous marriage before that. But the authorities did nothing. If they had acted upon that in the first place, then he never would have been free or able to start his suicide bomber training camp in New Mexico. The point being that if governments, non-Muslim governments, simply enforce their existing laws and enforce them upon Muslims, even when the Muslims find them offensive and contrary to the rules of Islam, then a great deal of jihad activity would be stopped. Not all of it, because obviously, as long as there are believers in the Quran and Muhammad, there will be jihad. But the solution lies simply in having the courage to enforce our own laws and the courage to protect our own cultures and our own way of life. And there are measures in India in the same way that are designed to ensure that there would be a single law to which all citizens are accountable. That's a perfectly reasonable proposition and one that nobody should oppose. But the Islamic groups oppose it precisely because they understand that were it carried through, jihad activity would be stymied. So, this is a general outline of the situation. I understand that there are quite a few people with questions, so I will stop there. There's a great deal more that can and should be said, of course, but we will take it based on your own concerns. And once again, thank you all for being here.
Thank you so much, Mr. Robert. Uh, so now I invite for the questions from the audience. I request to please put forward your speaker request, and there are already many, so I will try to process them on sequence. And when you come to the speaker, please raise your hand so that we can go sequentially. Uh, right now, I will welcome Dr. Jagdish. He's a professor in Canada. Please, Professor, sir, please go ahead with your question.
Bob, I went through your some of the publications, and I felt quite, as interested in knowing more about what you have discussed in one of your books, which is published by you, about the existence of Muhammad. This is something very, it can become a controversial stuff in countries like India or Pakistan. But there is some truth, and you must have done a lot of research, and I'm sure you would like to enlighten us more on this aspect a little more. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Doctor. I assume I can be heard?
Oh, definitely, yes.
Yes.
Oh, good. Very good. Thank you. Yes, this is the book, Did Muhammad Exist? And in it, I examine the records from the 7th century. Muhammad is supposed to have lived from 570 to 632 of the Common Era. And yet, from 632 to the 690s, there is no mention of Muhammad that corresponds to anything of what we know from the Islamic tradition as being part of the life and career of the Prophet of Islam. There are a few mentions of the name Muhammad, but always in each one of them, there are features that don't correspond to what Islamic tradition tells us about Muhammad. So, for example, there's a mention of the name in the 630s, and yet Muhammad in that mention is depicted as leading the Arab armies that are invading Syria, when according to Islamic tradition, Muhammad was already dead by the time the Muslims invaded Syria. Now, this may seem to be a trivial distinction and a simple error on the part of the author who mentioned Muhammad, but the problem is that everyone makes those kinds of errors who mentions Muhammad, and there are very few who mention him at all. until the 690s. And it's not until the 690s and thereafter that we start to see actual mention of Muhammad as recognizably the prophet of Islam. The earlier records also say things such as that he was preaching the coming Messiah, when there is no concept of that in Islam, that there's a coming Messiah. The idea is that Jesus will return at the end of the world, but that's really not a huge central concept in Islam. In any case, the silence about Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, for the first 60 years of the spread of the Arab conquests, as the Arabs poured out of Arabia, conquered North Africa, conquered the Middle East, conquered Persia, and began to enter Sind and conquer it as well. You have no mention of who the Quran, that is supposed to contain the motivation for the conquests altogether, and no mention of Muhammad, who is previously supposed to have united the Arabian tribes and then given them these instructions to wage war against unbelievers elsewhere. And so it's an extraordinary omission. Now, people often say that an argument that evidence of silence is not evidence of absence, or absence of mention does not necessarily mean that the person who is not mentioned wasn't there. However, in this case, the silence is a little bit more important than it might be in another context, precisely because there were so many people who encountered the Arab invaders and asked them why they were invading. And notably, Sophronius, the Christian patriarch of Jerusalem, he left a number of written records discussing the conquest, and yet he never mentions Muhammad, Islam, or the Quran. He speaks a great deal about the invaders, but he gives no hint that they had a new religion, a new prophet, or a new holy book. And there are many others like Sophronius as well, who give no hint that these are the warriors of a new religion. So it seems, if one is to take the evidence at face value, that the picture of Muhammad we have from Islamic tradition, that arises in the 9th century for the most part, 200 years after he's supposed to have lived, is more myth and legend than historical fact. And that Muhammad himself was created to justify the conquests and unify the Arab Empire, rather than being the impetus for the creation of that empire. And this is all explained in much more detail in the book, Did Muhammad Exist?
Thank you so much, Mr. Robert. Uh, let's go ahead with taking some few more questions. I would like to go to XYZ. Please go ahead with your question.
Thank you, Gupta ji and Robert, for coming here. And I've been following you since 2013, and that's where I started learning about the religion and jihad. So that's my journey. You are part of my journey, our journey. I have a question on the topic jihad, especially India and South Asia. So what we have seen is that when it comes to West and even China or any foreign policy, official foreign policy, they have two different standards of dealing with Islamism. It's like so when it comes to their own interest, they have a different policy of dealing with Islamism. We have seen how Americans dealt with Osama bin Laden. They waged war against Afghanistan for 20 years. But when it comes to Indian interest, we see a different paradigm being set. And looks like the West diplomat, the international diplomacy, international realm, they think like Islamism is a good tool to destabilize, radicalize the population, and keep the countries in control, like India. And we see the same thing happening with China. We all know that China, how it deals with their own Uyghur separatist population. But when it comes to India, they always support OIC and similar causes all over the globe. So, would you like to tell when the world would like to unite against this global Islamism and not take my Islamism versus your Islamism? Thank you.
Yes, you're quite right. And the difficulty stems from the unwillingness at the top of American officials to acknowledge the reality of jihad at all. Uh, right after the September 11th, 2001 jihad attacks in New York and Washington, 6 days later, on September 17th, 2001, President George W. Bush went to a mosque in Washington, D.C., and he was standing in front of various Muslim leaders, including the leader of the Council on American Islamic Relations, which has been established by the U.S. Justice Department as being a front for Hamas, the terror group in Israel, and Abdurrahman al-Amoudi, the head of the American Muslim Council, who is now in prison for financing al-Qaeda. Bush, of course, assumed that these people were moderate Muslims and rejected the jihad attacks on 9/11. And he stood in the mosque and proclaimed that Islam is peace, and that our struggle against the perpetrators of 9/11 has nothing to do with Islam. Now, the situation that you described in your remarks about the US favoring Pakistan, favoring the OIC over India, stems from the same false assumptions that Islam is peaceful, that the terrorists are twisting and hijacking the peaceful religion of Islam, that we can make common cause with Islamic countries such as the Islamic Republic of Pakistan, and that this will be mutually beneficial. Of course, the US has been giving money to Pakistan every year, billions every year, to fight Al Qaeda and the Taliban. And even after it was discovered that the ISI and the Pakistani government in general had been using a great deal of that money to finance Al Qaeda and the Taliban, this money continued to come, and the amount was even increased by the U.S. Congress. The unreality is extraordinary, and the wishful thinking and fantasy upon which it is based. But this is the policy of the US government, and it's because they won't come to grips with the reality of jihad that they pursue such policies. The sane alternative would have been to conclude an alliance or strengthen the alliance with India after 9/11, and to formulate an anti jihad alliance with numerous other countries, including some with which the United States is at odds. But instead, almost immediately, Islamic groups in the United States who have infiltrated very skillfully and have very powerful allies in the US government, they were able to prevent that from happening and to deform US foreign policy so that there would never be, and there never has been, a realistic response to 9/11 or a realistic response to the jihad in general. It's not even on the table at this point. The Biden administration is worse than ever in terms of being unrealistic about the nature and magnitude of jihad.
Thank you, Mr. Robert. XY, seems like you have some follow-up question. Please go ahead.
No, no, I just get my endorsement. Let's take more questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Robert, one quick uh, comment on Islamophobia bill. Can you a little bit elaborate on that? Because seems like it's not just within the boundaries of U.S., but also it is gonna create some committee which is gonna uh, kind of monitor how the other states are doing. But there is